Let's welcome to the podcast, friend of the podcast and regular poll star of the podcast, indeed. It is Scarlett Maguire, the founder and director of Merlin Strategy. Scarlett, hello. Great to have you with us. A year of Keir is what we're focusing on today. Can you just actually outline for us, according to polling, where was Labour, where was Keir Starmer this time last year, i.e. at the general election? What was the general election result? And where do they find themselves now, 1 year on?
Well, it's interesting because if we think about actually this time exactly last year, the polls weren't that accurate when it came to Labour's performance. They were overestimating how well Labour was doing. In actual fact, even though Keir Starmer ended up with an incredible majority, about the same size as Tony Blair's in 1997, still underperformed polling expectations, and it was a little bit of surprise when the next day, when we finished counting all the results, not me, I wasn't hand counting them personally, but when they'd finished being counted, to see that Labour actually only ended up with 34% of the vote. Because obviously it's a huge achievement to win the sort of majority, especially given where Labour were coming back from after that historic defeat they suffered in 2019. But it is relevant, and it's especially relevant to now, because they won this big parliamentary majority, but because it was on a low share of the vote, it was more fragile than other majorities of that size have been. And what we're seeing now is that coalition is starting to crumble, and that really matters.
The coalition, just remind us where that had come from. When we talk about the coalition, who is the coalition?
So Labour had ruthlessly, and actually in some ways very cleverly, it was very sophisticatedly focused on what they called hero voters. Now there's a more complicated definition for that, but hero voters, as conceived by Deborah Mattinson in very, very broad brushstrokes, were historic Labour voters who'd perhaps voted for Brexit, voted for Boris in 2019, but who were then very unhappy with the Conservatives and back up for grabs again, and especially in thinking of places that we like to call the Red Wall and constituencies around there. And Labour thought if they could get enough of these voters back, that meant that firstly they wouldn't have to pile up that many voters elsewhere, that it would be very efficient, and even that they could afford to lose voters potentially on their left flank. So that was the decision they made. It really pulled off. So they really pulled it off. It worked very well for them. But the question is, for a lot of people, where are those voters now? They look like the sorts of voters that should be going to reform, and indeed are going to reform. And then the question is, what does that mean for Labour? We're a long way from the next general election, but I think it could still spell trouble.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so I wonder then, when we consider a year of Keir, I think there are various flashpoints along the way, aren't there, that probably nudge this 34% of the vote that they emerged from 2024 with, that have perhaps eaten away at that. What would you identify as the flashpoint, and then we'll sort of unpack them a bit?
I think undeniably, for me, the most important flashpoint has been the announcement that they made on winter fuel cut payments last summer. It's the most noticed and also most disliked of all of the Labour policies. And it really, really cut through. I remember talking to Labour people who were asking my opinion in August, September last year, saying you absolutely have to U-turn on it. It's proving so disastrous. Not on the doorsteps, I don't go to doorsteps, but in focus groups, it was clearly people were very agitated by this. So undeniably that. There was a lot of fuss around the donations and the clothes. We don't actually tend to hear, that didn't stick. It wasn't very lasting in people's memories, although I do think it added to this overall sense that people do not like or trust politicians very much, and they have very low expectations of them. So I don't think that would have helped. I think the autumn statement we got from Rachel Reeves was also quite a big moment. So actually, even though initially on the sort of first day or so it wasn't a car crash, it wasn't like some of the budgets or fiscal events we've seen from previous governments, it landed pretty badly, especially thinking about things like NICs. And the employers' NICs has actually, I don't think, had the effect that Labour wanted it to. And then otherwise, I think you can look at what's maybe causing Labour some damage with its own backbenchers, and a problem that then that causes things like the benefits and the benefit cuts that are being tabled, or rather the two-child benefit cap. But they are the moments that stick out so far. Now, I've talked so far about the bad moments. There have been some better moments. So initially, Keir Starmer's handling of the riots in Southport, that was sort of an early high point for the Prime Minister. And then since then, we've seen that generally, now obviously this last week is a bit of a test for this, and we don't know quite where the UK is going to land in the developing situation in the Middle East, which is obviously incredibly difficult. But we've seen that as well, Keir Starmer's had a bit more luck on the international stage and how he sells that back home.
Yeah, that's interesting too. Joe, let's bring you in on some of these flashpoints as we're discussing with Scarlett, because I'm quite taken by the idea that there has been good stuff in here, but it perhaps gets drowned out because of all the bad stuff. When you assess the kind of political operation that has been this Labour government of the last year, how do you rate it? What is your analysis of it?
I think the biggest thing that will be the sort of Achilles heel is the expectation management that really hasn't been there. I think the problem has been that from the minute that you looked at the election strategy and all of the talk when the government was sort of taking shape, it was all about all these incredible things they were going to do. It was all about huge promises. And in reality, it was probably pretty naive to think you could do half of what they were suggesting you would do in the period in which they would be in government anyway, let alone when the finances were in the poor state that everyone was saying they were going to be. But then Labour got in and found that things were worse than they had thought they were going to be. I think the interesting thing about expectation management is I don't think it's just about the public, though. I actually think a lot of it's about its own side. And that its own MPs, not really, particularly because so many of them are new, having no real idea about the limitations of what government can do and the challenge for government, the challenge really for the government of governing. Governing is much, much harder. Opposition, it's very easy to use different moments to find an alternative position to adopt, to have a reason to complain about what the government are doing. And then suddenly you are the ones in charge, having made huge promises, and you can't afford to do what you want to do. The civil service are telling you something completely different to what you're expecting, and you're not quite sure how to manage that process. There were plenty of politicians at party conference who were saying, well, we thought the civil service were going to do this, and actually they've been telling us something different, or they don't quite know how to make this thing a reality. And yet, if you spoke to Conservatives who just left government, they were saying, well, the point is this lot don't know how to direct. They need to tell the civil service what they need to do. So you have this real mismatch. So I think the expectation management bit was a huge blunder. But I think more generally then, that's where things like Scarlett mentioned on winter fuel, that became such a huge shock for everybody, but including their own side. And that then meant that for its own side then having to defend that becomes even harder.
In your view, Joe, have things sharpened up in the transition from the Sue Gray era to the Morgan McSweeney era? So the replacement of Chief of Staff, number 10 Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. Sue Gray, of course, who was leading the operation in opposition, having been the most senior civil servant indeed, and trying to mastermind some of these things that you're pointing to, navigating the civil service, actually implementing things. She lasted a few months before Morgan McSweeney replaced her. Has there been a noticeable difference between these two chapters?
Well, the thing is that what's also happened in that period is you also had a communications change as well. So it's hard to know exactly what's happened, but you've also seen a change in terms of communications. So you've seen Matthew Doyle stepping back, and you've had James Lyons then stepping in. And so there is an element of, what's causing what change, what's happening, different people leaving government, other people coming in. It's hard to know exactly what's happened for what reason. But I think there has been I see it as that there's two very distinct things going on. There's international care and there's domestic care. And I think international care is in a different place to where domestic care has been. I think actually on the world stage, Keir's in a different place to the way he's perceived on the domestic front. And I think I don't know who is controlling that. I don't know whether that is more because it's Foreign Office led and the guardrails are there and it's less campaigny. But there is a very different sort of statesman-like figure that you've seen with Keir Starmer and the way he's managed to handle Donald Trump, which I think a lot of people will say has been more successful than perhaps the way he's handled some of the things on a domestic front.
Scarlett, can I bring you in on some of these themes as well? Because recently, actually, just in the last couple of weeks, Sir Keir Starmer has kind of conceded that the story of this government hasn't been sharp enough, that people haven't sort of connected with what this government is trying to do. And I think he's sort of conceding there that they haven't sold it properly, that people haven't connected because they don't know what to connect with. Is that your assessment too?
It is and it isn't. So I think it's always actually been an issue with Labour and Keir. They had a more focused general election campaign, which was on change from the Conservatives. On actually, interestingly, it's basically what Reform are now picking up. They were campaigning on the fact that Britain is broken, and that is now Reform's slogan, which I think there are actually some lessons that Reform are maybe not learning for where Labour has come a cropper since. But one thing that we've heard in focus groups about Keir Starmer since he became leader of the opposition was that people weren't sure who he really was, what he was about, what he cared about and what he wanted to do. That's why some of those early attacks from Boris Johnson were so effective. Things like Captain Hindsight and Flip-Flop, because there was this general sense amongst the electorate that they weren't getting what he actually was, they weren't getting the truth of what he wanted to do. And not necessarily out of dishonesty, or now increasingly, so for example, if you do word clouds of Keir Starmer, they increasingly come out with the word liar, so people are going to dishonesty. But people thought that he was sort of hiding from them what it was that he was about, or that he didn't stand for anything at all. And that was always a weakness of his. And I think the combination of the fact that if I was in Labour, you would have known this was a weakness of Keir Starmer, because you'd have sat in lots of focus groups just like I do, and you would have also presumably throughout the campaign been hearing from voters, just like I was hearing from, how desperate they were for urgent radical change. So I find it very difficult to understand why that first 100 days of a Labour government looked like it did, because it wasn't just that they were missing a story, they were missing a whole plan to communicate that they understood that people wanted urgent change and they were going to start delivering on it. And actually what you got instead was a vacuum. And that was why things like winter fuel took up so much of that space, was because there was such a vacuum. And I think we're now in this fascinating position where, it's, as you said, we're coming up to a year of Keir Starmer. Ipsos released some new political polling and it was fascinating. And what it showed is that Keir Starmer has the worst ratings of any Prime Minister 11 months into office, with the exception of Gordon Brown. And obviously Gordon Brown was already taking over quite a beleaguered Labour government by the time he came in, that had been in for 3 terms already. And so he's in a very different position. The fact that Keir is doing worse than Rishi at this stage, after all the problems that those Conservative governments went through, it's pretty terrible.
Kirsty, we've been discussing with Scarlett there that sort of concession from Keir Starmer on the story of government and perhaps not selling that enough. And Scarlett rightly was bringing us back to the big pledge, the big promise of this Labour government, which was change. That was their manifesto, that was their campaign, that was their whole messaging. Have we seen change in a year of Keir?
No, and I think that's some of the problem, right? I mean, just to be fair to the government for a second, look, they were elected, as we recall, on a pretty loveless landslide. It was a very small proportion of the overall vote, and it was a mile wide and an inch deep. And the minute you build a broad coalition like that, from the minute you get into government, all that happens is it starts to erode round the edges. What has happened, of course, is it's eroded much quicker than that. And I think the fundamental problem is exactly this point. If you promise change after what has appeared to be years of kind of managed decline, and we get another year of managed decline, or that's how it feels to all intents and purposes, that is some of the problem. If you promise change that is built on 2 pillars of trust and growth, and you erode your trust through the actions that we've seen this government commit over the last 12 months, and you stifle businesses' ability to grow, and therefore we're sort of stuck in this stagnant kind of doom loop, it doesn't feel like things have fundamentally changed. And instead of having a clear and compelling narrative for, what Labour was for, we got missions and we got pillars and we got steps and we got foundations and yada, 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 like a complete wonk fest of language that meant nothing to anybody. And I, because I don't like to just criticise from the sidelines without some constructive criticism about it, I think the thing that has always baffled me about them is I think they've always had the key for what the basis of their compelling narrative should be. and it's securonomics, although I'm not for a second saying that they should use that awful, awful word. But in essence, if you're trying to build a proposition, particularly if under this chief of staff, they're increasingly looking to sort of shore up their red wall, I'd be fascinated to for Scarlett to come back at some point and talk to us about whether she's obliged me by going through a focus group with these words. But I think the pocket of where they need to be, and you need to deal with the world as it is, not as the world as you would want it to be, in an increasingly kind of conflict-driven world. Said no one in a pub ever, what I really want is for Britain to be a clean energy superpower. I mean, it just sounds like a nonsense from where we are.
They want cheap bills. Go on, Scarlett.
Well, yeah, they want cheap bills. So what, where I think they should sit their pocket of narrative, and where I always think they should have sat their narrative arc, is around three words, which is strong and secure and safe. So you have secure jobs, safer communities and a strong nation. You build your narrative around that. And it feels like the right kind of narrative for the world that we now live in. I want jobs that I can trust to be there. I want a community that feels safe, and that taps into community cohesion as well as kind of crime and antisocial behaviour. And I want a nation that feels strong and robust enough to withstand some of the conflicts that we're increasingly seeing around us, and a Prime Minister that doesn't feel awfully like we've brought a lemon to a knife fight.
Go on, Scarlett.
Well, I just want to say what Kirsty was saying about that is fascinating, and it is super interesting because firstly I did some work recently that showed half of Labour voters, 49%, so half of Labour voters don't think the government's moving quick enough on change, which I think just underlines everything we've been talking about. And then the other thing that I've done, which caught my eye recently, was that I was doing loads of questions about how pessimistic people are, both about the country and also their own lives, and how badly they feel, whether they feel confident meeting their bills at the end of the month, how likely they think there might be political violence. And on all these questions, what really struck me was that if you are feeling more optimistic about these things, and don't get me wrong, no one's feeling super optimistic about any of it. In general, the outlook's quite bleak if you look at where the consensus falls. But the more optimistic you feel, the more likely you are to be sticking to Labour, or indeed the Conservatives. Really? And the more pessimistic you are. So Reform voters were much closer to Green voters in most of their answers to these questions. And I think another thing Labour is really missing, and again, this is why I was saying there's some parallels with Reform and where Reform might end up going, and some lessons they can maybe learn from it, because you can't just say the country's broken and then not deliver on any of the optimism and things to fix it either. There's no future sense of things getting better. And I think they were missing that right from the beginning. And it's a difficult one for politicians. It's a difficult needle for them to thread, because people are also sick of politicians over-promising and, all the rest of it. Absolutely right. But you cannot be relentlessly miserable, because it looks like the more miserable people are, the more likely they are to go to the populist parties anyway.
And you also stifle the economy, because you've got businesses that won't invest or make, and even actually consumers that don't make major purchasing decisions because they're worried about stuff.
So if you're feeling optimistic right now, you tend to be a Labour or Tory supporter, and if you're feeling pessimistic right now, you tend to be a Reform or Green supporter. Is that a fair summary?
Well, it's effectively that, yes, if you are voting Labour and Conservative, you're more likely to feel more optimistic than the Reform and Green voters. Not necessarily meaning you're super optimistic, but they're just and they're much closer together on most of those questions as well. And then the Reform and Greens on the other end of things, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. Truly. Okay, right. So a year of Keir. So we've talked about change. We've talked about expectation management. Kirsty's offered a kind of rival view, strong, secure, safe, on what actually Labour could have sold. Here's what you could have had. Where are the Conservatives in all of this, actually, Scarlett? We should maybe mention that, because Kemi Badenoch is doing her best as leader of the opposition. Kirsty's visual demonstration, for those of you who are not watching, is that they might be somewhat imploding, I think, if I've interpreted that correctly. Kirsty, is that fair, what you've just said?
That is a not unfair characterisation.
But then, here comes Bobby on the beat, Bobby Jenrick. Robbie J is here to save the Tories, is he not, Scarlett?
Yeah, I think the Hats at conference said Bobby J, didn't they?
Yeah, they did, sorry, yeah.
Anyway, The Conservatives, I think, are effectively nowhere to be seen. So they had a shocking set of local election results, which came after a shockingly bad general election result last summer. And since then, things have only really got worse. Ipsos, I mentioned that polling earlier. I'm not just talking about Ipsos, but they not least because they're a competitor. They they've had polling tracking going since 1976 on political issues, and the Conservatives recorded their lowest ever score in the latest batch that they just released.
Wasn't it 15%, Scarlett?
15%.
Yeah.
It's absolutely extraordinarily bad. And so when all of the hand-wringing was being done about the future of the Conservative Party and a potential death spiral, at the summer election, that was when they were 10% ahead, of where they are now. They finished that election result on 24%, so they've gone back substantially. I think it was made a lot worse by the defeat they suffered at their local elections. And what we've seen since then is reform have been really buoyed. I think this is always a likely outcome, as a lot of Conservative voters who don't mind reform thought, okay, well, they're the best bet now, I'm going to vote with them. And this is actually underlined as well with what people are doing at the ballot box. I'm always keen not to overread into local council elections, especially not local council by-elections. It's very, very striking that we've had a lot since the local election, and the Conservatives have won none, not a single one. Whereas earlier in the year, they were actually capitalising on some of that upset with Labour. They were finding the odd council by-election going back to them, and that stopped happening. And I think the Conservatives are just in real danger of falling even further. And at that point, it becomes quite hard to turn things around.
Yeah. Kirsty, what's your take on the Tories?
I think, Scarlett will correct me if I'm wrong. I think if both the Conservatives and Labour drop below 20% and Reform maintain sort of above 30, 31, 32, and bear in mind, I think in this same Ipsos Murray poll today, they're at 34%, then Reform are in outright majority territory in all likelihood. I think we're increasingly moving towards a world where it's very difficult to see, unless there's a radical transformation of their fortunes, that Kemi Badenoch survives to the year end.
Wow.
I think that I can't speak to anybody now that thinks that she will survive unless there is a radical change in fortunes. And originally there had been, well, let's just get another set of local election results through, and now I think the frustration has grown to the point where she is in peril the minute that at the moment under Conservative rules she's safe for a year since election, but come November I think she'll be almost in the point of immediate danger. And with Robert Jenrick, I think we've moved potentially from the point where people would support him in spite of the fact that he's more likely to create a sort of unofficial pact with Reform, to actually being more likely to vote for him because he's likely to form an unofficial pact with Reform, and that the only way that the Conservatives can stave off an existential threat and live to fight another day is if they form part of a coalition and find a way to unite the right at the next election.
Joe, actually, on the Robert Jenrick point, can I put to you his technique, his strategy here? We're sort of referencing his viral videos, basically. I think the first one, the kind of most famous one, was where he started challenging people who were dodging paying fares to get on the tube in London. And he was kind of chasing after them, calling them out, saying, why have you just crashed through the barriers and not paid? That's the sort of approach he's taking. Now, there is something serious about that, isn't there? That he is speaking to what people are looking for, perhaps even within Kirsty's strong, secure and safe mantra. He is picking on issues that feed people's concerns in those areas, and he is kind of representing them. How effective is a social media strategy built around that Robert Jenrick seems to be deploying, in your view?
Well, there's a couple of things. The first is actually he went before the fare dodgers. He actually did something with GB News about tool theft, and he went and challenged people that were selling tools that had been stolen from tradesmen, and raised the issue and was saying that it was a big issue, and actually it is something that the government have picked up since. I think
that's featured on our podcast too, I might add.
Indeed.
I was going to say we were featured that campaign.
We are totally in, we're in the midst of all what's going on. But there is something really interesting that I've looked at what Robert's doing, and there's a couple of interesting things. You may remember that back in the doldrums for the Tories, Michael Portillo went and became a hospital porter, and did a load of work about sort of going to see what was really going on in hospitals, and did a load of media around it. And when I was working for the Tories a long time ago, we just had the 2001 election defeat with William Hague, and IDS took over. And IDS was in a similar position to Kemi in that there was this huge policy vacuum. And we also just had 9/11. There was a real sort of period of instability. And I was working with Damien Green. And Damien Green was a former journalist who was doing the shadow education brief. And I actually stuck Damien in a school for the best part of a week. And he would go out in the morning with the teachers and do uniform checks. And he would sit in on lessons, and he'd basically have all the NUT sort of, well, pretty much all of the militant NUT lot would go and sort of just give him what for during the break times that they had. And he got just absolutely consumed by what it was like to really be a teacher day to day. And he filled the vacuum, which was the policy vacuum that was created under IDS, because there was a lot of global instability. The Tories were trying to figure out how to rebuild themselves. And it was the way that we handled that period. And I've got to say that I see a lot of that in what Robert Jenrick's doing. I see him sort of picking up key issues that he thinks the public care about, which, you know, whether Scarlett would go onto the street and find 10 people that would name fare dodging straight away as the thing that would bother them, perhaps not. But it's something that's relatable enough that even if it's not the fare dodging itself, it's the breaking of the rules and not being caught, not having the law being administered properly, not having the, you know, we can all probably tell a story about a shop we've been into where you've now got a knock to go in the shop because they won't just have the doors open anymore because of theft, or, you know, meat that's been locked behind a sort of in a cabinet because they're worried about items being stolen, staff that will tell you about experiences. So it's that whole general things aren't quite right. But it's an interesting, I think what he's doing, he should now have his caps made really for this year's conference with Bobby J, safe, secure, strong, probably underneath Kirsty, and take your words. But I think there's an interesting thing about what he's doing, but actually how does that play in back to Scarlett's point earlier about those that are more pessimistic not sticking with their party's vote? And is Jenrick going to keep hold of those people? Is he a sort of, perhaps not along party lines, but is he, by pushing those areas that people are frustrated about, is he pulling them away from Kemi's support to his part of support within the Tories, rather than leaving the party entirely? Is he sort of trying to get the group that perhaps are frustrated and might be peeling away from the central party? Is he trying to capture them before they get to reform, for example?
Scarlett, what's your take?
I think that's such an interesting point about Robert Jenrick. And I think one of the biggest questions will be, if you look at the polls at the moment, Reform voters are the most behind their party. Out of any other parties, they're the most convinced they want to vote Reform. And interestingly, just as an aside, because I did some focus groups with some Reform voters recently, and who were all dead set on voting Reform. And so then when I asked them about Nigel Farage, I thought they'd say, yeah, he's fantastic, we think he's brilliant, we think he's amazing. They didn't think that at all. They were quite dubious about him, actually. They thought he was more relatable than the other guys, and they definitely liked him more. Liked him sort of, they personally liked him, but they were quite dubious about him as a character and him as a politician. And for me, what that shows you is just the sheer amount of frustration with the other main parties. Now, the question for Robert Jenrick will be, if he takes over, maybe when he takes over, whatever that is. I think firstly there's a question about will the membership vote for him? What do the Tory members look like now? No one really knows. There's not many of them left. Have all the ones that might have voted for Robert Jenrick left the party? Have they all gone to Reform? Would they come back again to vote for him? Do they care that much? There's all those sorts of questions as well, if it went to members, to see if he'd get through. And then I think the other question is, what will the Conservatives be polling then? And if it's below a certain amount, it will be harder to win voters back from Reform, I think, because it will be a harder justification. If you're in a point where Reform is dominant in the polls and 9-10 points ahead of Labour, as they've been in that Ipsos poll today, and even if you look at the averages, I think they're clear water between them and Labour, even if it's not that much of a lead. Then it's harder to persuade voters to back for the Conservatives again, because why would I, if I'm unhappy with this government and happy with the way things are going, why would I then back a loser? And so I think that could be quite difficult, even voters that might like what he's saying. In fact, when I was looking at all of this, I was thinking, if I was Robert Jenrick, I think I'd be more tempted to try and join Reform than I might be to try and lead the Conservatives. But things can change, a lot can change, and there are lots of weaknesses that Reform have as well, which I'm sure we'll be more exposed to and see more of over the coming months and years potentially. But I don't know. I just thought it is quite interesting, and I'm very interested to see if that is the direction the Conservatives go in.
But the interesting thing I've found in recent conversations is the bit that isn't getting out into the public, which is probably not something you'd pick up, Scarlett, in the work you do, but the actual mechanics of the Conservative Party, the individuals that have been sacked, the cuts that have been made, the talent that's been lost, and the frustration with some of the people that are left who feel angry at the sort of dismantling of the party because it's being felt that it's not being run very well, because the Conservatives don't have an alternative policy platform. What it does is it's enabling Reform to kind of oppose without really having to have any detail, because the Tories haven't got any detail anyway. So it's not as if you're comparing a very advanced sort of policy platform that the Tories have got and going, well, Reform have got nothing. Instead, you just look and go, nobody's got anything. But actually, I think Nigel and others are speaking my language compared to Kemi and her team that aren't. But the frustration within the party itself and what's left is it really interesting, because the damage to the foot soldiers, we always talk about those people that actually go and campaign, but also there will be plenty of those people that are the foundations of the party that actually, if they're looking at where they see perhaps a slightly more interesting, or perhaps they're seeing more opportunity to have a voice, they may well be the people that will cross over to Reform, because they'll see that, well, the old structure's dead, the friends I used to be with all the time, they've all gone, what's left? The voluntary party's been decimated. And they may well then, the things that would have kept them, if it wasn't the leader, it might have been other things around the party that they saw. If that's all gone, it makes that switch much easier to make.
Yeah,
that's so interesting. And I think, I think you're right. I don't tend to talk to sort of members and local councillors when I do the work, but it is interesting, because one thing you do hear, and one thing I was hearing in the run up to the locals, for example, was the fact that lots of people were just saying, well, we haven't seen or heard from the Conservatives at all. We're normally canvassed, normally people are trying to get our vote, and they've just been absolutely nowhere to be seen, which would absolutely speak to what you've been talking about. I mean, I think if I was the Conservatives, obviously I don't think Kemi, no matter what she says, is inclined to give Robert Jenrick even more of a platform than he's got at the moment. But one of the reasons why we're all talking about him is he's the only one that's really out there doing anything and out there trying. And if I was the Conservatives, I think, especially if you look at which party is trusted to handle which issue, the economy is the most important issue for voters in the country. It's sort of neck and neck between the economy and immigration, but it is, and historically it's incredibly important, especially when times are tough and people aren't feeling great. There's no party that has a clear lead on the economy right now. I would give Jenrick the shadow chancellor brief and just say, go out and make all the videos, go and land as many blows as you can against the Labour chancellor, who is the least popular politician in the country. I think the Conservatives, because Reform haven't set out a clear offering on the economy, because it's not something they actually spend a huge amount of time talking about, it's not something they've established a clear lead, or in fact any lead on at the moment at all. It's sort of the Conservatives are in there with a chance with Labour and Reform to sort of own that issue. And if I was them, I'd be throwing everything at it. And instead you have Mel Stride, who may be a fantastic person, but is basically invisible.
Yeah. How that, Kirsty? What do you make of that?
I think it's a very good suggestion, and it's there's about much chance of Kemi doing that as me becoming the next Mrs. Idris Elba. But it's interesting to hear what Joe was saying about, and it's the same. The reason that the Jenrick videos have cut through, and we talk about them a lot, is because, like anything that is a relatively small image, it speaks to a wider truth, which is why we all had a jolly good time at Keir Starmer's expense when he was at the summit last week and the trade papers fell out of the US president's folder, and he scurried to pick them up. So you've got all these pictures of him at the President Trump's feet. It speaks to a wider truth. And the same with Jenrick. Yes, tool theft's not the world's biggest issue. Fare dodging is not the world's biggest issue. But it just speaks to everything is broken, nothing works properly, and people that take the mick get away with it all of the time. You know, I get on a train and my train fare costs a fortune and I get to sit there and listen to everybody else's music playing because I'm too frightened to say politely to them, do you think you could turn that down? I'm tired. I don't want to listen to your endless TikTok reels, you know. And so it's that kind of, you know, if you're in that kind of work hard, you know, try to get on kind of crowd, it just seems that you know, what Ed Miliband used to call, you know, the Great British Promise just isn't working for anybody anymore. And that is what Jenrick is tapping into. And because the fundamental pillar of how this, you know, where this government bet the farm on growth being the answer to all its problems, basically, and we haven't got it. And because the vast bulk of that problem you can tap directly back to the Chancellor's budget last year, and yes, some of it's about Trump and tariffs and an unstable world, but the vast majority of it taps back to that, which is why we will see such a fall off when that feeds through in those, because it only came in April. And we're already beginning to see it have an impact on the jobs market, vacancies and business confidence and what have you. There's such a, you know, Scarlett's 100% right, there's such a rich stream there for someone to be able to go at with the kind of passion and, you know, social media nous that Bobby J... that Bobby J has got. He's always been very good at social media, by the way. I used to work with him at DCLG, and it was the one... You know, he cared not a jot for press notices and op-eds and things. The only thing he really was interested in and wanted to invest time in was social media, because it is exactly that, is the chance to speak, you know, directly to people and say, look, I get where you're at. And it's back to that point we were talking about the other day. You know, tribal politics, party politics is dead. And I think we're almost moving a little bit away from values-based politics to almost politics by vibes. Everybody knows, you know, and it's interesting what Scarlett was saying about the difference between people wanting to vote reform and whether people rate Nigel Farage or not. I think everybody knows he's a bit of a snake oil salesman. They don't care. I think everybody knows that the tax and spend policies that Reform have put forward so far are a load of old hooey. It doesn't matter to them. That's all kind of baked in. They're not these people. They're not this political elite that's promised so much and delivered so little, you know, decade after decade after decade. And you just see voters now going house to house to house going, right, you promised that, you know, you were a shower, particularly to Conservatives, particularly over the last 6 years. You promised change and growth and trust. You've broken our trust. You've not delivered growth, and you certainly haven't given us change. It's like same old, same old. So we'll go over here. Even though I think this guy is, you know, a bit of a snake oil salesman, and even though I don't think these policies are worth the paper they're written on. And that is what happens when you know, spend years and years and years putting your rhetoric up here and your delivery kind of way down in the, you know, in the dirt.
If you take it back to Keir Starmer, one of the things in the election that they got quite good at doing was trying to position him in different environments. He did that interview with Gary Neville, I think, where he was walking along, and they did a sort of social media video, and you think Keir's sort of gone in the direction of it's all very Prime Minister, it's all very staged, everything is delivered by an event somewhere random with a bunch of people who look like they're being held hostage behind them at some business, and it's all very sort of big and official. And actually, when you look at the success of someone like Nigel Farage, and look at actually the fact that Bobby Jenrick has been getting the sort of commentary about what he's doing, there's a lot to be said for actually stripping it right back and having that connectivity by using things like videos, using social media, using different formats for interviews. And I thought it was very interesting last week that Keir Starmer did the interview he did with Peter Cardwell from someone's kitchen, which Peter Cardwell got a bit of flack at Talk TV about. People, I saw Andrew Neil asking him questions about whether it was an actress and whether it was a real kitchen or a real house or whatever. But there was something interesting that they chose to do a very different environment for that announcement last week. And I do wonder if we're going to see a change in some of the environments, because when people seem a bit more relatable, Scarlett, I don't know if that's something that you find in focus groups in particular, that's where the connectivity tends to happen better.
Sorry,
just to jump
time
in,
out.
sorry, Kirsty.
I've got to go.
That's fine. Can you just leave your laptop on just so it finishes the upload? That's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Should I log off but leave it on if you want me?
Yeah, if you press the red hang up button, the leave button, and then just leave the tab open.
Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Sorry, guys.
No, thank you.
Whole day's been a disaster. See you later, Scarlett. Thank you so much for coming on. See you later. See you, Calum. Bye.
Cheers,
Bye.
Kirsty. Bye. Have fun tonight.
Cheers.
Right, go for it, Scarlett. Joe, what was your question? Sorry, what was your point,
So my question was essentially,
No.
is it that relatability when you see being able to connect, using media that connects, the way Robert Jenrick's done it, the way ultimately, I mean, this is Dominic Cummings said, Nigel Farage has taken reform so far with an iPhone, essentially. Is that part of the thing that perhaps being PM is almost makes you more distant and that you need to think about the presentation more to be more connected?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think actually, especially for someone like Keir, who was never very relatable to them anyway, it's interesting because you've seen people try and land attacks on Nigel Farage, especially from Labour after the local elections, that he's a billionaire, that he's not a billionaire, that he's very rich, that he's out of touch, and that he just wants to hang out with his rich friends and he's not interested. Now, I was quite interested they went down that line because that didn't work on Boris Johnson. When they were faced with this old Etonian, it didn't matter how many times people said Boris Johnson was an old Etonian, because voters said, well, I still think he is at least trying to understand me a bit better, or I can see myself having a pint with him, cannot see myself having a pint with this other person. And that's what we're getting all over again, I think, with Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage. And actually, again, I talk about those voters not necessarily trusting Nigel Farage, which I don't think particularly they do. But yeah, they can relate to him a lot more. And they see him even, one of them said you see him with a fag and you see him with a beer, but that in a way that seems natural and not staged. And I think there is absolutely part of that counts. I also think the other thing that's in Nigel Farage's favour, even though, interestingly, just as Labour are moving to the right on a lot of issues like immigration, like benefits, like welfare, to fend off the threat from Reform are trying to very aggressively mainstream, and they're trying to then outflank them from the left and trying to position themselves no longer as a sort of right-wing fringe party. They're trying very hard to distill that image. But I think what Nigel Farage also really has in his favour when it comes to this question of relatability, which I think is very tied to how authentic people seem, is that actually members of the public, even though they can have quite a short memory, they do have a sense that he's not changed his tune on issues like immigration, and the rest of the debate has come to him. And I think especially in that contrast to a lot of the toing and froing we've been seeing from other politicians on that issue, but also other ones, I think that also hugely counts in his favour.
I heard Stephen Swinford make this point on Times Radio this week, which was basically, I think what you were saying there, Scarlett, that actually Labour are embracing the idea of Reform UK and Nigel Farage saying things about certain issues because it opens up the opportunity to talk about those things, to offer something on those things, and to kind of go and meet Reform where they're trying to position the conversation in society. Guys, it's been a really good conversation. I just want to finish with this. A year of Keir, right now, what should he worry about or focus on most? What should be number one priority if he's to get a grip of this thing and address the issues that we've been talking about over the last 45 minutes or so? What should be number one? Scarlett?
I think for Keir, it's going to be about keeping his own voters on board rather than trying to win over anyone else, and that's going to be difficult enough. And for his own voters, I actually think he should go hell for leather on the NHS. It's the thing they still trust Labour on. It's the thing that still people are very uneasy about. Reform, especially Nigel Farage, always have been uneasy about the Conservatives. I would go all in on the NHS.
Joe?
Very boringly, I was waiting to see if Scarlett was going to say the NHS, but it's exactly the one that I think, because I still believe it is at the crux of so many issues. If you cannot get a doctor's appointment, if you're unwell, if you're unhappy because you're unable to get the doctor's appointment, you can't see somebody, you've got a family member, etc., that's unwell. It's the NHS, it's the social care picture, it's all of that bit that he needs Wes Streeting to do an incredible job, really, and needs Wes to sort of succeed, because I think it still comes down to the bit that if you really judge how well the UK is doing, if the NHS doesn't work, nothing works.
Guys, thank you so much, and thank you for your time. A year since the general election, and I feel just as tired as I did then.
But do you feel more optimistic, though, or not?
Well, I mean, I'm optimistic by nature, Joe. I was born optimistic, and I will stay optimistic, always. Scarlett Maguire especially, thank you very much. Thank you for joining the pod today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Joe, and thank you, Kirsty, as well. Your thoughts on a year of Keir are very, very welcome, of course. You can email hello@whitehallsources.com, and we'll read those on the next episode. That'll drop into your podcast feed next week, and we'll talk to you then.